Hades' project Zeorymer is sort of what I think of as the height of maximalist 80s mecha design. When you look at the earliest mecha, like Tekken 28 let's say, they're very clearly designed to be rendered quickly and easily. It's low on detail and its silhouette is simple with this big chunky body and these tubular arms. But as you go forward through the 70s and 80s, designs start getting more and more intricate, with animators really pushing the limits of what could be reasonably depicted in motion. The trend goes towards intricate, complicated mecha that require very talented key animators to pull off an animation, which can often only appear in OAVs or movies or other projects that have a significant development time. These sorts of designs kind of sum up anime in the 80s for me, like Nagano's Byzantine ornamental knights or Kobayashi's brutalist militarist infantry. It's a time when mecha animators were showing off the level of skill they'd reached in translating complex designs into movement. And Zeorymer, with its gothic structures and its visually complicated robots covered in details and spikes, are maybe the apex of this. These robots, which in the OAV were designed by Yasuhiro Moriki, really stretch the idea that giant robots are even humanoid. Do these really resemble metallic men, or are they more like metal beasts? They're these visually overwhelming constructs that could basically only exist in the bubble era OAV format. The plot of this series isn't really important. I'd say it's basically an even more edgelordy Mazinger, but the mechanical designs are fascinating. They're mecha as kaiju as much as anything else. Moriki's mecha are often seen as impossible to animate, which makes the sheer level of fluidity in this feel like a constant flex. In fact, Moriki also did the designs for the Gundam Hathaway's Flash novels, and one of the reasons they were seen as impossible to animate for so long was because of those incredibly busy designs. How could you render these in animation? When we finally got the first of the Hathaway films a few years ago, the mobile suits were almost entirely CG, with only a few static 2D shots. Something I find interesting though is that if you compare that film to Zeorymer, there are some similarities in how they chose to approach the battle choreography. As we mentioned before, that Gundam Hathaway puts a lot more emphasis on the ground level of its battles compared to other Gundam entries. The designs are obscured by shadows, only occasionally being revealed by unstable light sources, often generated by the firing of weapons. When the film's main battle sequence ends and we see the Penelope Gundam, it hovers and emits this strange resonating noise, giving it an uncanny, unearthly quality. With the emphasis on burning buildings and environmental destruction, this feels more like the original Godzilla than a standard Gundam battle. The effect is clear. These machines are monsters, they dwarf humans, and it would be terrifying to be anywhere near one. I love the Gundam Hathaway designs, but I also think they look kind of ugly, but that's actually part of what I like about them. They're ugly in such a specific and uniquely 80s way, and seeing a 2020s production trying to wrestle with that is so interesting to me. What's interesting is I think the production team on Zeorymer had some similar ideas on how to depict Moriki's designs. Much more than most other mecha series I've seen, it's really interested in the pure scale of these machines. There are so many shots of civilians running away, often from low angle, and with a lot of structures to really emphasize the sense of scale. There's one moment where the Zeorymer takes a step in a river, and then we see waves violently crash into a nearby town. The visuals aren't as obscured as Hathaway, but both projects share the same interest in the overwhelming environmental destruction caused by these designs. Zeorymer is not an amazing OAV, but if you like these designs, I would say it's worth it just on that basis alone. It's one of the best examples of mecha as horrifying, mecha as environmental disaster, mecha as demonic metallic chaos. It's pretty metal. So this is an episode about mecha that have elements of horror, and there's actually way more of these than you would think, and a lot of them are really good. So I kind of like the idea of this being maybe like a Halloween tradition on my channel. There's a bunch of these we can make. In general, these videos probably won't be as in-depth as others, more just a quick-fire look at various mecha anime with elements of horror that I think are cool. The connection between horror and mecha has become particularly clear to me in the past few years, particularly because something kind of unexpected has happened. I've noticed recently that in English-speaking sci-fi writing circles, it seems like mecha, and particularly that sort of organic Eva-style mecha, have become kind of a motif in queer and especially trans science fiction. For instance, you have Porpentine's Psychonymph Exile, which is a story about a retired mecha pilot. There's Gretchen Faulkner's Dreadnought, a kind of psychedelic, poetic mecha story. Even something like Isabel Fall's Helicopter Story could be seen as part of this. Interestingly, all these examples are very much examinations of the uncanny elements of mecha, often using the genre to explore a sense of disassociation. Pretty much all of these examples are very heavy on body horror. This development has been a cool surprise, and is, I would say, where a lot of the most interesting mecha writing is happening right now. For as much as mecha is obviously a very militaristic genre, there's always been as much, if not more of it, that is essentially adolescent melodrama, stories of heightened emotion and alienation. And seeing that become articulated in new ways is always exciting. I might do a video about this one day. But that's not actually what I want to talk about here. What I want to talk about is a tangentially related, early example of the mixing of queer body horror with a mecha framework. Legend of the Blue Wolves is an explicit yaoi OAV from 1996, which for the longest time has basically been a punchline in mecha fandom, appearing in memes more than anything. I finally watched it a few months ago, and honestly, it really surprised me. Though I should say this is not a work I can recommend to a lot of people. It's, a very problematic, explicit 90s OAV. It comes with pretty much all the major content warnings you would expect from that. But genuinely, I think Legend of the Blue Wolves is kinda good. It's this grimy, paranoid, surprisingly somber mecha story. It takes place during a war between humanity and this alien species, and the alien species is basically winning, and as a result, the humans are becoming a lot more authoritarian and militaristic, and the whole thing has this very oppressive atmosphere. I don't really want to give too much away about the plot, but it actually reaches a conclusion that I found genuinely creepy and unsettling. It's very interested in the mixing of the organic with the mechanical. In general, the aesthetics are really impressive. The mecha designs are honestly pretty good. I could see them in like a 90s Gundam show. They've even got their own version of a Zaku. And it's also mixed with a lot of kind of cyberpunky environments. Like, look at this. The tone of the movie is interior and sort of art film-esque, with this green haze over the whole thing, and background music mostly composed of classical piano pieces. It's also weirdly personal feeling, with these really long interior monologues by the main character that felt like genuine pieces of reflection by the writer. Kind of amazing that this was released in the States under the title Hot Gay Space Cowboys, because that implies a level of pulp that doesn't really match the content of this piece. There is a lot of sex in this, but a lot of it feels pretty unerotic by design. Just like everyone's favourite Salo, this is a turn-off movie, not a turn-on movie. I would also say that the sex doesn't really feel shoehorned in, so much as it is representative of the brutality of the world this takes place in. And in general, this is a kind of slow and sincere piece. There's definitely a personal voice behind it, which is one of the reasons it's such a shame that its production is kind of shrouded in mystery. So there's no listed writer on this thing. I'm guessing the screenwriter probably felt there'd be some stigma to having their name attached. The director is Yasunori Urata, who has a pretty spotty career, mostly doing episode direction, but he was also series director in the Gonzo Hellsing anime. And according to ANN, one of the mecha designers was actually Makoto Kobayashi, which is interesting because he was and is a pretty big deal in mecha design, working on a lot of Gundam and Yamato stuff. The studio was Phoenix Production, which is interesting to me because they were actually one of the main studios behind the 90s Giant Robo OAV, one of my favourites, a very grandiose and ambitious project. Looking at their credits, you get the sense of the studio with a lot of talented animators trying to find different scrappy ways of making money. There's another BL OAV in their catalogue. There's also Sin, an adaptation of the American PC game, and they also did the Legend of the Overfiend movies. What I'm saying is I get a sense of rebelliousness and outsiderness from this studio. I guess that's probably why they would be the ones to try and do an explicit yaoi mecha OAV. From what I can tell, this was not a success. It was planned to be the first in a series that didn't materialise, but I can understand the attempt. First Gundam was obviously very big in the early BL scene, and while I think that fandom had kind of dissipated as UC Gundam went on, it was still something that was there in the culture. I'm not really sure if this was for a Fujoshi audience or a gay male one, but often that distinction is messier than you would think. If you look at, for instance, June, which was an early BL magazine, it was edited by a man and read by both gay men and also het and lesbian women. I get the impression this movie is basically going for both audiences, particularly with the character design as being kind of in between the gay commie masculine look and the 90s Bishonen style. I recently did a list of my top 25 anime, and I somewhat jokingly put this OAV on there, but really only somewhat jokingly, because this does embody a lot of what attracts me to this medium. It's this very strange story that is so much more personal and singular than it probably needed to be. Like, I always imagined that this would just be a cheap X-rated thing with a few mecha shoved in, but no, this is a real piece of horror science fiction that a lot of care and thought was put into. I don't know if I can recommend this to anyone because it is so singular, and in some ways it's so ugly by design, but really, I'm very glad it exists. You know, I've been enjoying a lot of stuff these past few months. The tweets of Hellsing creator Kota Hirano, for instance.
I personally think that about half of the reason why foreigners have a lot of erotic content related to furries is because of the way their cartoons often depict characters with eyes like this.
But something I always enjoy, oh yeah, I'm getting so good at segue, are the works of Ryosuke Takahashi. You know, I just love this director's stuff. It just always works for me. And he's someone who has both that mecha militarism and that more esoteric, ethereal side. Gasaraki, for instance, has a lot of mecha as occult horror. But I think his most keenly horror mecha series is Blue Gender. This is a post-apocalyptic series that he co-directed with Masahi Abe in the late 90s. It's about this guy called Yuji who wakes up from a coma in a world basically taken over by giant bugs. The first half is him being taken on a journey by this hardened soldier, Marlene. Basically, Yuji has this like special blood that can hurt the bugs, and they want to transport him onto this big space station called Second Earth, where they can like experiment on him to help fight the bugs. That's basically the plot of the first half of the show. This wasn't produced by Studio Sunrise, but actually AIC, the company responsible for Tenkai Myo. And I think it does have a different vibe from your Sunrise stuff from this period. It feels slightly older in the audience it's going for. It feels slightly harsher, or maybe a lot harsher actually. It's not really talked about very often now, and I don't think it ever really was, which is strange because it did air on Toonami. And it's a shame because I really think this is a great show. It's only 26 episodes and it's a lean, grimy, pretty unique take on the genre. But anyway, when you see people talk about Blue Gender, usually what they say is that the first half is really good and then it sort of drops off in the second. That's basically the take I see on it online. And I don't quite agree with that because I really like the second half, but I get why people say it. Because I think the first half of this show is very good at what it's doing, and it's doing something that not that many anime does. In that it's a very, very dark, very lean, kind of post-apocalyptic road trip drama that isn't even that stylized. Just like they got to get from one part of the Earth to another part, and it's really brutal, really intense stuff. The Earth is completely fucked. It'll spend entire episodes just establishing how difficult it is to survive in this world. And the show is really merciless in that way. There's so many episodes in the first half that are just like, Yuji and Marlene will come across a community. Yuji will be like, we gotta help these people. Marlene is like, no, this is a distraction. But, you know, Yuji convinces her. But then by the end, they're all just annihilated by the monsters. And Yuji has to watch them all die. That's like a really common sort of first half of Blue Gender episode. A lot of the show is about this dynamic between Marlene and Yuji, where Marlene is this very monotone, very utilitarian individual. You know, she embodies this kind of post-apocalyptic ethos of withholding emotion, of looking out for yourself, and doing what you have to do to survive. And Yuji, on the other hand, is this contrast. He's this pre-apocalyptic individual. He's more emotional, more humanistic. And it's very much about these two different characters and their different ways of reacting to situations in this environment. Yeah, it's just this kind of really rugged, apocalyptic story. It's the kind of thing that you'd usually see more in OAVs than TV shows. And, you know, I think that first half of the show, it's just not trying to do that much. It's just trying to be this very tactile, gritty, dark show, and it's really good at that. And so in the second half of the show, they get onto the space station called Second Earth. And I think the reason why people get mad at the second half is there's just a big tonal whiplash. It's trying to do something very different. So in the second half, you've got a lot more characters at play. You have a civilization now, and you also have all these sleepers, all these kind of people who were also in comas being reawakened. So you have people from before the apocalypse who, like Yuji, have this kind of pre-apocalyptic sensibility. And it becomes much more of a psychological horror at this point. Something it really captures well, I think, is this feeling of being cooped up in an enclosed environment. Because the space colony, it's not a Gundam-style space station that's able to, like, replicate the environment of Earth. There's nothing pastoral about it. It really is just this dark, cramped environment where you get the sense there are way too many people, they're really rubbing up against each other, tensions are really high, resources are low. You know, and everything just looks like a military hangar, so it becomes very oppressive in that way. So I guess, like, in the first half, the horror comes from the loss of civilization, whereas in the second, the horror is other people. The second half is also where the gender of the Blue Gender title comes in. There actually is a reason for that, in that it sort of does try to become a kind of gender sci-fi. If you're familiar with literary science fiction, there's obviously this strand of it that's interested in exploring gender. That's one of the cool things you can do with the genre. You could imagine alien civilizations that might have different gender systems, or you could imagine genetic modifications and how that might alter how we perceive gender, or, you can just imagine a different human society with just a different gender framework. That's a strand of sci-fi that exists. As Blue Gender goes on in the second half, we learn that in this new society, there is no concept of gender, basically. People don't understand themselves to be men and women. Essentially, gender has become soldier, because that's everyone's identity, is just fighting against these monsters and just sort of serving this militarized state. So these pre-apocalypse individuals have this understanding of gender that the other characters do not. Along with this, there's this kind of sexual anxiety to the show. So part of it is that along with the shaming down of gender, sex in the show has become sort of unromanticized. So people have sex very often, but without relationship bonds. It's now a purely functional activity done to let off steam. And this actually starts happening really explicitly in the show that I was very surprised by for a TV anime. There's a lot of just like fairly explicit sex happening. And then you have this central relationship between Marlene and Yuji, which actually culminates in the second last episode in kind of, I think, like the longest sex scene I've seen in a non-ero anime. There's like a 5-minute just sex scene between Marlene and Yuji, and it's kind of great. I guess I'm learning I'm pro-sex scene on the sex scene discourse, because this was a really effective kind of culmination of their relationship that I was really impressed by. I was like, shit, I wish more anime did this, actually. I wish there was more like 4-minute, 5-minute long sex scenes to culminate relationships and shows. It was great. Yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting show. It's probably deserving of its own big retrospective, but I did my hour-long Takahashi video this year, so I don't have it in me to do one on Blue Gender. But I really recommend this series. It's really unique, it's really creepy, it's really cold, but it's got that kind of humanist Takahashi heart to it with Marlene and Yuji. Yeah, it's great. And I think the second half of the show is great too. Like, it zigzags between a lot of different plot points and ideas. It's not always clear where the narrative is going, but it's ambitious and interesting. I'd recommend this show. It's good. Watch Blue Gender. Just not quite as good as Legend of the Blue Wolves.